Hi everybody, I'm your host Kent Pavelka. Welcome again to MCC TV. More of what you need to know about Metropolitan Community College. We have an exciting discussion ahead with Tony Burroughs, who is an internationally known genealogist, author, and lecturer, and founder of the Center of Black Genealogy, as we discuss why black families should research their family histories. Tony was here most recently for the 14th annual Diversity Matters film and lecture series here at the college, and it's good to see you back, my friend. This is, I think, our third chat on the program.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate it big time.
Yeah, in 2008, 2012, so it's been 7 years since we've had a chance to chat.
Yes, and I still, you still look the same. Haven't aged 1 second.
You're right.
You're living a good life.
Well, it's always good to have you here. Talk a little bit about everything that you do and your history, your background, how you got started, and maybe an update on your focus since we last had a chance to talk.
Well, I got started very early on when I was in college, or I actually heard the word genealogy or family history when I was in college, because we were fortunate to have Alex Haley come and speak to the campus. So I heard the concept, never heard it before, and it was a fascinating talk. I said, hey, one day I'd like to do it before I die, but I got to pass the final exam. I forgot about it, and many years later I had a flashback when I was in college, and Alex was talking about this, and kind of got started and interviewed my mom and dad and got hooked on it. You know, I really, really loved it, and researched for several years before personal computers came out. Mm-hmm. Had more than I can process, and I got out of it, and then it just kept eating at me, and several years later I got back into it, and then I just kind of stayed into it, and so then now that's my life. That's all I do. You know, I just love it.
Where were you headed before you got redirected toward genealogy? I mean,
I was in the corporate world. You know, I was in the sales, and then from there I became a computer consultant, and so I was working on personal computers and working with not-for-profits and small businesses, you know, and it was good money in computers, you know, but it wasn't really my passion, you know. My passion was really in genealogy. So I got to a point where I was at a crossroads, and in computers, the hardware changes every year. The software changes every year. And to deal with clients, you have to be up where the clients are. So you had a tremendous investment in terms of hardware, software, and education to stay up with your clients. And I said, well, do I really want to do that, or do I want to do something I enjoy doing and also helping other people locate their ancestors? Mm-hmm. So I made that decision, and I left computers alone and went full-time into genealogy, you know.
Well, I think everybody's familiar with the terminology to some extent, genealogy. Just a quick definition, what is genealogy and what does a genealogist do?
Well, genealogy is the science of tracing family history, finding out who your ancestors are, doing it through actual research, finding documents to prove who your ancestors are. Sometimes you could do that with one document. Sometimes it takes multiple documents. But we don't just accept something because someone tells it to us. We don't just accept documents even though they may have a government seal on it, because there's errors in documents. So we have to understand what evidence is and how to prove relationships, how to prove identity. So that's what we're doing in genealogies. Hunting for our ancestors, finding evidence of that, and then going from one generation back to the previous generation. So as a professional genealogist, what I do is I teach other people how to use this methodology. I teach them what the documents are and how to analyze the documents. I also do research for clients that feel a need, have a love for genealogy, but they don't have the time or the expertise to do it themselves. They have the ability to pay for someone else to do it, so I'll research those families for them. Others I have that are people doing genealogy, but they get stuck, they have problems, they need some help. So I'll consult with them, analyze their research, and tell them what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and where to go, you know, from here to there. I also do some consulting with television programs that are working on genealogy programs. And I also I've worked with school systems, developed genealogy curriculums. I've written articles. I have a book out. So anything that has to do with genealogy, which also dovetails into African American history sometimes.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was the focus on the Diversity Matters presentation, why black families should research their family histories.
Right.
Why should they?
Well, I think that everybody should research your family history.
I know you do.
But
that was the focus.
Yes,
right?
yes, exactly. But it's more important for African Americans because our history has been maliciously denied and distorted. You know, when Africans were captured in Africa and brought over to the New World, their culture was destroyed, it was denied, and it was a facade to dehumanize them so it can justify treating human beings as if they were not human beings. So their names were stripped, their language was stripped, their religion was stripped, their history was stripped. Everything about their past was taken away and they were enculturated into British American culture. Our ancestors were given English names and English language and Christianized and all those different things. So now, several hundred years later, we have a yearning to know what our history was. So it's very, very important for us to go back and find out who our individual ancestors are, what was our history, what was our culture, what was our language, and all those different things, because that's a part of us. And I think everybody has that yearning to know who they are and where they came from. It's just very different in the African American community.
Yeah, more difficult.
Exactly.
To get
exactly.
to the background,
exactly.
the truth. So I think it'd be instructive. I hadn't thought about doing this, but so obviously you have done this for yourself, correct?
Yes.
What'd you find out about your genealogy?
We can spend about 10 of your programs talking about that, you know. But there's a lot of different stories. One, I found out I had an ancestor that was actually in the Battle of Lake Erie during the War of 1812. Something I never even thought, never even knew what the Battle of Lake Erie was. Found out that it was the most important naval battle in American history, where the first time in world history an entire British fleet was captured. And when they did that, and the battle was taking place right off of Lake Erie, or inside Lake Erie, about 10 to 12% of the men that fought in that battle were African Americans, which very few people know.
Slaves?
No, they were free men.
Yeah.
They were free men. Yes, yes. And historians have only been able to identify about a dozen of those out of about 100, 110 men. Because the naval records, Navy was always integrated. The Army was always segregated. But it was very difficult to try to get men to go off the land and fight in the water. People just didn't want to go in the water. So that's why they accepted blacks to fight in the Navy. So the Navy was always integrated. So the records are integrated, they're not segregated. So trying to identify those that were African American has been extremely challenging. Well, when I researched my ancestor and I found him, I looked at the list of names that they had and my ancestor was not on the list. So here I've been able to do my family genealogy and make a discovery of a person to add to the historical record that historians didn't know about this one other individual. So that's one of the things that I learned.
But the name wasn't there.
The name was on the list, but he was not listed as African American.
I got you.
That's what it was. So I was able to identify him as an African American, you know, that added to that historical record.
I probably showed my ignorance there. I asked if
That's all right.
it's free men, slave, 1812.
Well, they could have been either one.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So no, that was a good question.
Yeah,
It was a good question. It was a good question.
So what else did you find out about your family?
Well, I lived in a building, I grew up in Chicago in a 2-flat apartment building. In that building, I lived on the second floor with my brother and my mother and father. On the first floor was my grandparents. And my aunt and uncle lived on the second floor in the back. My other aunt lived in the basement. So we had a family building. My grandfather was a lawyer. I knew he was a lawyer because clients would come by the house periodically. He had an office downtown, and we would go downtown periodically to my grandfather's office. My father did some clerking for his father for a period of time. And sometimes my father would take me down to the courthouse and do some research and this and that and the other. I was just a little shaver. That's all I knew about my grandfather. Well, when I started doing my genealogy, my grandfather had deceased. So I had to interview my grandmother about her husband, my grandfather. She brought out these newspaper clippings, brought out these books he was listening to, all kinds of stuff. Also, I found out that he wrote an autobiography. It was just 4 pages. It was unpublished, but he wrote some notes about his life. I read those, and between looking at those notes, find him in newspaper clippings, find him listed in books, and finding him in census records, I was able to start to reconstruct his life. What I discovered was his father was a Pullman porter, worked on the railroad. His father got sick, and he died when my grandfather was in high school. His mother got sick. He dropped out of high school to take care of his mother. He went to downtown Chicago, and he got a job in a law firm. He was a messenger in the office. I looked at the next census, and he moved up from a messenger boy to a clerk. That was in 1920. I looked at the next census in 1930, and now he's listed as a lawyer. The newspaper clipping my grandmother had was from 1928. It was headlines that he was president of the Cook County Bar Association.
Wow.
Now, Chicago is in Cook County, so you can imagine how big Cook County was. And he was president of the County Bar Association.
And you never would have had any idea about all this.
No clue.
Had it not been for the additional work you did based on all her memorabilia.
My dad never mentioned anything about him. Now, we're talking about a guy who did not have a college degree, did not have a law degree, did not have a high school diploma.
Your grandfather?
My grandfather.
Yeah.
He's a high school dropout and president of the Bar Association. Started the Cook County Law Library. Started the Cook County Women's Auxiliary. He raised money for the first black congressman to become a congressman after Reconstruction in Chicago. I mean, you're talking about an attorney who was very prominent in Chicago, and I thought he was just a lawyer.
Yeah. We're going to get real quickly to the business of how to get going on getting into genealogy and researching your family history. But you talk about genealogy being way more than just finding out about your ancestors, and that it, for one thing, provides inspiration. And you just exhibited the inspiration I think anyway, that filled you up when you found out about your grandfather, right?
Exactly.
So that's what it can do.
Exactly.
It's inspirational.
Exactly.
So, I mean, to what degree have you witnessed that when people discover things about their families?
Well, very simply, back in the old days, before the internet, because I got started before the internet was long, people had to go to the National Archives to research your family history, and they had to pull out the old microfilm. So being at the National Archives, and it's filled with people reeling slowly through microfilm looking for their ancestors, and all of a sudden you hear these screams because people found their ancestors. It's like you know they're there, but until you see it in print or in old script handwriting, you really don't know, because sometimes you can search and not find them. Sometimes it's difficult to find them because, they might be there in the record, but they might be listed there differently than what you think. So when you actually find them, it's a euphoric moment. So that happens not now, it happens in libraries oftentimes, So you could really see the excitement from people, when they actually find their ancestors there,
Personal inspiration coming from all that.
Yes.
What's the most dramatic example of that you can think of you've seen from other people when they found out things about themselves and their families? Or a few of them?
Well, there was one where a lady was searching for her ancestors and found herself on the census,
Yeah.
Because the census was taken every 10 years. started in 1790. The next census is going to be taken this year, 2020. Again, it's every 10 years. But there's a restriction to protect people's privacy. So you can only look at census records that are 72 years old and older. So this lady was looking for her ancestors and looking for her parents and grandparents and had no clue that she was on the census herself, you know. So that was very exciting. I think she was
So she was old enough that...
Right,
yeah.
right. She was over 72 years old.
Yeah.
So she didn't think about the fact that she was actually listed there on the census herself.
Yeah.
So when people look at the census, if they're older than 72 years old, then they're likely going to find themselves on the census, you know, which is really different, you know. Yeah.
You talk about genealogy helping people to improve their understanding of history, not just their own families, but history in general.
Right. Right.
Size up what, you know, what's most salient to you about African American Black history that has been uncovered through genealogy?
Well, I was the keynote speaker at the annual Harriet Tubman Conference in Cambridge, Maryland, a few years ago. Cambridge is where Harriet Tubman lived, there and also in other places in Dorchester County. And so I knew about Harriet Tubman, but I said, if I'm going to be the keynote speaker at our annual conference, I need to up my game on Harriet Tubman. Mm-hmm. And so this scholar who I knew had written a new biography on Harriet Tubman, Kate Larson. And I had been on several programs with Kate, so I knew her pretty well. I had heard her speak about Harriet quite a bit. I had had her book, but I had never read the book. So I said, let me just sit down and read Harriet's biography by Kate. I started reading it, and Kent, it was like blowing my mind. Harriet is a mythical figure, but there's so many different aspects about her life that people don't know about, because either they just listen to the myth or they watch a film, but they never go out and actually read a scholarly book on it to learn all the nuances about Harriet. They know that Harriet worked on the Underground Railroad, but if you get outside the Underground Railroad, they don't know jack about Harriet. I'm reading the book, and they're talking about Governor Andrew from Massachusetts sends Harriet down to South Carolina to work with these people that had been liberated. So she goes to Hilton Head, South Carolina. She works with the Massachusetts 55th and 54th Infantry, as well as some of the other South Carolina units that are in Hilton Head. She's a nurse. She's a laundress, she's a cook, and she's a spy.
Spy?
Yes. Those are all very, very different tasks than working on the Underground Railroad. The troops go up, I think it was the Combahee River, and they go out and liberate these enslaved people off of these plantations. By Harriet going back and forth into the South to liberate all these people, she knew how to hide. She knew places where to go, where not to go. She knew how to be quiet. She knew how to sneak around and whatever. So she led these units into these plantations and liberated over 700 people.
Wow.
Came back. When the troops left Hilton Head and they went down to Florida to fight in the Battle of Olustee, then Harriet went with them. My great-great-grandfather was in the Massachusetts 55th. He was stationed in Hilton Head, South Carolina. He went down to Florida and fought in the Battle of Olustee. He had to know Harriet Tubman.
You bet.
He might have eaten some of Harriet Tubman's food. She might have laundered some of his clothing. And I'm just like blown away.
Absolutely.
Here, a connection to my ancestor that I never even thought about, never even imagined. But if I had not researched my family history, I never would have been able to place my ancestor into that historical context with this mythical figure. I also learned that the myth of Harriet Tubman was very different than the real Harriet Tubman. The myth is that Harriet went down to the South and liberated over 300 enslaved people. She didn't do that. If you think about it, if someone was enslaved in the South, being brutalized, or their family members were brutalized, if they ever got out, you think they're going back? Not really. So why did Harriet go back? I mean, the myth is that she wanted to free all these people. That's not why she went back. She went back to get her relatives. She went back to get her sisters, her brother, and her nieces and nephews. And she was trying to get her niece, and it was difficult to get her niece because her mother was scared to leave. So when she went back and she couldn't get her niece.
It's her sister.
Right.
Or sister-in-law.
Her sister, her blood sister, and her sister's daughter. Mm-hmm. When she couldn't get back, she took the other people with them. The other relatives, she took her father, her mother, and the other people that were from that farm. And then she went back again to try to get them again. So she took relatives and friends. Mm-hmm. She wasn't just going back willy-nilly. And the numbers of people she actually took were closer to 70 rather than 300. Mm. So you ask the question, well, where did this 300 number come from? There was a biography written on Harriet in the 1890s by Sarah Bradford. And Harriet wanted to get a pension for her work in the Civil War. Now, she got her husband's pension. Her husband was in the Civil War. She got her husband's pension. But she wanted to get a pension for her work during the Civil War. And she wasn't able to get it. So Sarah Bradford wrote a biography on her and elevated what she actually did to make her more of a mythical figure, hoping to get the money. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. But Harriet never said that she liberated 300 people. Yeah. And that myth has persisted to today. I watched a documentary on Netflix 2 weeks ago about Harriet, and they're still talking about this 300 figure, which Kate Larson, through her work, just exploded that myth, because Kate went back and did original research in courthouse records and newspaper records and all these different kinds of things. So one of the things I love about genealogy is it gets you into real history. You cannot research your ancestors successfully until you place your ancestors into historical context. So wherever your ancestors lived, you have to know the local history. You have to know the regional history. You have to know the United States history, because those are going to affect your ancestor, and those are going to affect the records, and those are going to help you understand how and where your ancestors lived, what they did, and what affected them around them. So history and genealogy work hand in hand. So the more you work on genealogy, the more you are into history, and I just love it.
Yeah, begs the question the conversation about by uncovering truth over myth in terms of history, how we can't correct history, so that you don't watch a TV show right now that has inaccuracies.
Well, historians are correcting history all the time, but the problem is, and I was discussing this with Barbara Valenquez here at the university, is that people don't want to read anymore. They just want to look at videos, and when you substitute a book for a film, you don't understand that filmmakers take creative license.
Sure.
And they will add in there.
And edit.
Exactly.
For
exactly.
Time consideration.
Exactly. So you get a different view of history when you're reading a book versus watching a film.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about, now I guess I'm asking this in terms of your own life again, or others that you worked with regarding genealogy. What are some of the more startling corrections that you have been able to discover? Omissions that you've turned into myths that you've turned into real fact?
Well, two we've already mentioned in terms of the Battle of Lake Erie,
right,
as well as Harriet Tubman. But another is where our names came from. Now, African Americans and white Americans will all say that African Americans don't have African names. We have European names, English names.
true or
and
not?
that our names came from the slave owner, okay? And so what they do is they teach you that you should trace your genealogy back to 1870, just like anybody else, and then you need to...
1870 because?
1870 is the first census after the Civil
Okay.
War.
Okay.
When you research prior to the Civil War, the majority of African Americans were enslaved. And they're not listed, for the most part, on census records by name. In 1870 is the first census where all African Americans are listed on the census by first name and surname. All right. So it's key to trace your genealogy back to 1870. Then your research is totally different because you're researching enslaved people, not free people.
How do you connect those two? A list of slaves of a slave owner, how does that turn into names, and how do you connect the two?
Extremely complicated. Extremely complicated.
But that's what you do, right?
That's what you do. That's what you do. But the first part is destroying this myth that I'm getting ready to explain. And so if you assume that your ancestor took the name of the last slave owner, because again, we're going backward into time, so you have to take the last slave owner and go to the previous slave owners. If you assume that he had the same name as your ancestor, most of the time, you're going to be incorrect. In my research, I found that the formerly enslaved person only used the surname of the last slave owner in 15% of the cases. That means you make that assumption, 85% of the time, you're researching the wrong guy. Now, he probably had the name of the slave owner at some point in his ancestral history, but not necessarily the last one. And again, genealogy is based on evidence. It's not based on assumption. So if you assume they had that last name, 85% of the time, you're researching in the wrong direction. So in doing genealogy, you have to understand these myths, and you have to bust up these myths and start dealing with facts and reality. Okay?
But on that specific point,
Yes.
how do you then do more research to uncover the real name?
What you do is you research primarily during the period of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a period after the Civil War up until 1877. And they call it Reconstruction because they busted up a slave society, and they're taking 4 million enslaved people, transitioning them into freedom, and they have to exist in society very differently than they did where they're enslaved. When you're enslaved, you're prohibited from reading and writing. Now, as a free person in a free society, you got to be able to read and write. So you have to teach people how to read and write. During slavery, you were not legally able to marry somebody. So now in the free society, you have to have a legal marriage. Because if you have assets, you have to transfer those assets at your demise to your spouse, your widow, and to your surviving children. But you can only do that legally if you have a legal marriage. So now all these formerly enslaved people have to have legal marriages. So all these kinds of things transitioning from a slave society into a free society is called Reconstruction. Now, in some of those records created during Reconstruction, the formerly enslaved person tells you, well, when I was enslaved, this was the name of my slave owner. This was the farm or plantation that I worked on.
Going back further than the last slave owner.
Exactly, exactly. So what our job as an African-American genealogist is to find a record where that free person who was formerly enslaved tells you explicitly, this was the name of my slave owner. That's direct evidence that you can take to the bank, okay? Another record would be like a slave narrative, where formerly enslaved people were interviewed about their experiences during slavery. And so they would tell interviewers, yes, I'm a former slave. I grew up on so-and-so's farm, so-and-so's plantation this was his name, this was this mistress' names, this is what I did, these are the kind of crops I grew, this is my family members that lived here. So he's telling someone the name of his owner, and again, that's direct evidence.
And that would be the initial slave owner with a
No, that's the last slave owner before freedom.
Well, but then you were talking about that name isn't necessarily the real name.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
you got to get back even further.
Exactly. You have to take that through generations of enslavement. To give you an example, in my family, I had ancestors prior to the Civil War that were enslaved. I have other ones prior to the Civil War that were free. Like the one that was in the Battle of Lake Erie, he was free long before the Civil War, okay? The family that he married into had a history of enslavement. So my ancestor's name was David Truman, was freed in 1806. And they were free from 1806 up until past the Civil War. The person who owned him wrote a will in 1795. She died in 1797. Her name was Margaret Hutton, but my ancestor's name was David Truman. So he had a different name than the last slave owner. So what I had to do as a genealogist is to prove this person named David Truman was enslaved by a woman named Margaret Hutton, who's only listed on her will with the first name David. So the question is, how do I prove that? Well, I had to trace Margaret Hutton and do her genealogy. So now I'm not only doing the genealogy of the African American family, I'm doing genealogy of the white family.
Bring them together.
Exactly. And trace her back and find her maiden name, which was Go, and trace her Go family back. They were in Pennsylvania when my ancestors got freed, but she had come into Pennsylvania in 1773, brought 25 enslaved people with her from Prince George's County, Maryland. So I had to trace them back from Pennsylvania into Maryland and trace the family into Maryland. And she intermarried, her ancestors intermarried with a Magruder family who intermarried with a Go family. So I had to trace the intermarriage back through these 4 different families to find out where that Truman name actually came from. Mm-hmm. So my ancestor was actually using a surname that went back in his family through generations. So when he became free, he declared the name of an ancestor that went back to a very early period, not this later period. So in fact, he was doing genealogy. Mm-hmm. He was keeping track of his ancestral name that went back generations. You know, so that's what African Americans have to do. They have to find that last slave owner and then trace his family to find out where he got these enslaved people from. And sometimes it goes back through successive generations. So it's very complicated in order to do
it. It is. Which brings up, I mean, we could go for 2-3 hours here, but mm-hmm. we were talking before we went on the air about Ancestors.com.
Right.
Versus what you do and how you
Right.
do genealogy.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that. I mean, a lot of people want to do this.
Right.
But they're doing it online.
Right.
So
right.
what's
right.
the... How,
and the Ancestry advertises online quite a bit, you know. Ancestry started as a book publishing company. They were actually publishing books on genealogy.
Are they connected with the Mormons?
Loosely.
Loosely, okay.
They're a private corporation on the stock market. I think they're on the stock market. The reason I hesitate is they go back and forth from private equity into the stock market and back and forth.
Okay.
I just can't remember where they are right now. But they're a private corporation. Some of their employees, you know, are Mormon. I mean, they're headquartered right outside of Provo, Utah, mm-hmm. but it's not a church-owned company. The church itself, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we call the Mormons, they're very big in genealogy,
right.
and they have their own genealogy arm called FamilySearch. And FamilySearch is a huge presence on the internet, and you can go to FamilySearch.org and you could research your databases of names and find your ancestors in there, very similar to Ancestry.com. Okay. They both have some similar records, they both have different records. So it's not a Mormon company, but it's in Utah and some of the employees are Mormon. But what Ancestry.com has evolved into is they have created these algorithms which you could enter in a name, and once you enter in a name, their algorithms will search their database to see if they had that name and who that name is connected to. So they can suggest these might be some of your ancestors. And so if they find a name and a connection, they'll give you what they call a shaky leaf. And that shaky leaf is who they think connects to your ancestor and who's related to you. Now, it's up to you to determine if that person on that shaky leaf is actually related to you or not. Now, if you don't have genealogical skills, then you might not be able to figure it out. Right.
Yeah, you just guess wrong.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Whereas if you learn how to do genealogy research, A, either you don't need that shaky leaf, or B, when you see that shaky leaf, you can say, well, this is my ancestor, but this is not my ancestor.
Right.
You know, and so that's two different ways of researching. And unfortunately, Ancestry is not really teaching you how to research. They're telling you, we can do the research for you.
Correct.
You know, so a person that's coming into genealogy, if you come in through a genealogical society, and there's thousands of genealogical societies around the country, or if you come in through a university that has a course in genealogy, or if you come in through a person who's a genealogist that knows what they're doing, then you could actually learn the methodology and the ins and outs of learning genealogical research and how to collect documents, how to analyze documents, et cetera, versus going to Ancestry.com, putting your name in a database and let them do everything for you.
Yeah.
Two different types of, dealing with it.
You could either validate or dispel the accuracy of what you.
Right.
I mean, it'd be a way to do. You could do
Right.
both.
Right.
See if
Right.
see if you
Right.
end up with the same
Right.
answers.
Right. And what they don't realize is Ancestry has these databases that instead of you letting them do the research for you, you could use their database and actually do it yourself. So I use Ancestry every day. It's a great company. You just have to understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of using the company. So again, to the person that doesn't have any real training, it's difficult for them to make those kinds of decisions.
Come a long way in genealogy, right?
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a while.
Getting into genealogy today versus prior to, utilizing the tools that are available now.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that. How
Well,
it's evolved.
the interesting thing is, again, in the old days, if I wanted to do genealogy, I had to get up,
Footwork.
shower, shave, dress, drive to the National Archives, which for me in Chicago, it was a good half-hour, 40-minute drive. I'd have to take the indexes, I have to pull up the microfilm, look to the index, find my ancestor in that index, then I'd put that microfilm back, go to the census microfilm, look up my ancestor. Sometimes I'd find them, sometimes I wouldn't, And if you didn't find them and you had to look through the whole county, that's a 3-hour search, okay? And I've done that sometimes, not finding my ancestor, Now you get up, you don't have to shower, you don't have to shave, you don't have to dress, you just turn on the computer, and you can do, sometimes in 10 minutes, what would take you 5 hours to do in the past. So some of the things you can do in lightning speed. So that's a real help. Although there's hindrances with that as well, because my name Burroughs I found spelled over 20 different ways. So if you go to a database and you put it the way you spell it, if it's spelled a different way, sometimes you can't find them in that computerized alphabetical database. So that presents a problem.
So the computerized database may be incorrect.
Well, it's not. Well, A, it could be incorrect, but B, if it's spelled 20 different ways, are they giving us all those 20 different ways so we could look at all those? Mm-hmm. Or do we have to input those 20 different ways? So you have both. But to your point, yeah, you have indexers that can't interpret the spelling and they input it the wrong way. I have an ancestor named Preston Brooks, Preston. The indexer couldn't decipher the fancy P and thought it was a C and put it in as Creston Brooks, Creston. So it was a bear trying to find him in that index. I finally found him, but I had to jump through a lot of hoops in order to find him. You know.
As an advocate of folks getting into their genealogical history, I mean, what's your pitch to people? Why should people go forward and do this for themselves?
Well, I mean, I love it. You know, I think everybody should do it, you know. And so what I try to encourage people is that you need to know it because it gives you a good foundation. You know, you need to know where you came from. You need to place yourself and your ancestors into historical context. African Americans helped build America. But you can look in the books or look at the films and it doesn't really tell you that. But you see that your ancestors played a role just like everybody else. They might not have been a general, which they talk about General George Washington and President George Washington. But they might have been a foot soldier that worked in that Revolutionary Army to help win the Revolutionary War. They might not have served as president in the White House, but they might have built that building where the White House stands, you know. So our ancestors played a role, and I think that if our people knew the role that their ancestors played in history, that they would have a better understanding of history, they'd have a better understanding of their family, and they're more able to navigate through this world as well as teach their children that you should have pride in your ancestors and that they played a role just like every other community did and every other person, even though they might not be in the films and they might not be in the books, you know. And when you do your genealogy, you look in the original records and you see what's really there, not what someone had homogenized or taken out and put there for you to pick up.
Yeah, that last 40-second soundbite of yours kind of sizes up the whole thing. It gives you pride.
Yes.
Based on accuracy and information that nobody knows.
Yeah, yeah.
Really.
Plus you develop skills. You develop skills that you can use for the rest of your life. And so if you're able to interpret from genealogy, you know, records and analyze documents, then you can interpret and analyze emails that come across your email system. You can analyze and interpret things that you see on Facebook or things that you see on television that may not be true, but you've got skills in order to analyze that.
You're a private investigator is what you are.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Yep. You're right.
Your book, Black Roots, A Beginner's Guide to Tracing the African American Family Tree. The ABCs of how to get started.
Absolutely.
Please.
Absolutely. As I spoke around the country, people would always ask me, look, there's no good books on black genealogy. Won't you write one? So I was teaching at the university and, a course in genealogy. So I decided to take that course and put it into book form. And then as I gave lectures around the country, I would take individual of those lectures and put those into a book. And as I had people review it, they say, well, this book's not about black genealogy. Anybody can use this book. I said, I know, and I really debated about that. But I said, if it doesn't have African American or black on it, then blacks are not going to read it because they've been left out of so many, they will think that they're not in there. So I kind of sacrificed the larger audience for African Americans so they would pick that up and use it.
So everybody can pick it up.
Everybody can pick it up.
Yeah.
And I tell people, if no matter what ethnicity your ancestors were, you could read this book. Just substitute your ethnicity for African American because you have parallel newspapers, parallel books, parallel religions that are very similar to what African Americans are. Just find out what's unique in your ethnicity, but you can use the exact same methodologies and research that I use putting together Black Roots.
Black Roots, A Beginner's Guide to Tracing the African American Family Tree, or Czechoslovakian American Family Tree.
Exactly.
Chapter in the book called How to Create a Family Tree. How do you create a family tree?
Well, you create a family tree after you research your ancestors. What you do is you create what we call a pedigree chart. Very similar to Like down in Kentucky, the Kentucky Derby, you have all these horses that have this pedigree. You know?
And do you do this with pen and paper, or you do it online? Is there
You can do it both.
Okay.
You can do it both. You can do it in pen and paper. You can actually do it online. You can actually purchase software, and the software can create it. You know, in the old days, we always did it on pen and paper. Now that we have computers, I do all mine on computer now. You know, some people do it online.
Any software somebody could access that?
Pardon me?
Any particular software somebody could access that you'd recommend?
The one I use now is called Roots Magic.
Okay.
It's under $100. I can't remember. It might be $50 or less.
Okay.
They even have a little free version, which is a mini version. You know, and when you input the data, you input the first name, surname, middle name of your ancestor. You put in the date of birth, the place of birth.
What if you don't know? First of all, you start with your folks.
You only put in what you know. You can't put in what you don't know.
But you start with your parents, I assume.
No, you start with yourself.
With yourself, okay.
You put in your name, where you were born, and your date of birth. Okay. Then if you know your parents' names, some people don't know their parents' names. Or they might know their mother and they might not know their father. So you put in what you know, and you put in their name, you put in their date of birth if you know it, you put in their place of birth if you know it. If you know when they got married, you put in their marriage date. If you know where they got married, you put in their marriage date. Everything you know, you put in the database. Then as you do research and you find new information, you add that to the database. But you not only add those names, dates, and places, you also add the sources of where you got the information. Because at some point in time, you're going to get conflicts. I've got a grandfather, I've got 4 different dates of birth from 4 different records.
So did the internet or software spit that back at you that we've got some different dates, or did you find all 4 different dates?
I found all 4 different dates from 4 different records.
So you have to do that work.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And so you don't just ignore that and say, well, Mama said he was born on June 4th. Well, your mother didn't live when your father was born, so she's not evidence of his birth.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So she might have the wrong date. So what we have to do as a genealogist is we have to collect all those 4 different documents. Then we have to analyze when those documents were created, why they were created, who created them, and which is the most correct. But we have to maintain all of those because our analysis in the future might be different from our analysis today. But with the genealogy programs, we can input all 4 dates, input all 4 sources, and indicate to the computer, this is my analysis, which is the most correct date. Then if I collect additional sources, I can input those, reanalyze those, and I can change which one I think is the most correct.
Yeah, maybe go from 4 dates to 1 in the end, right?
Exactly. Well, you always keep all 4 dates because you want to know where they came from, but you always want to indicate which one you think from your analysis is the most correct.
Right, gotcha.
So when it prints out with the one you think is the most correct, but your database still maintains all those other ones.
So we're starting with yourself, your mom and dad. How far back can we go here?
Well, you go as far as the records can take you.
Well, I mean, how many records are there in the world? I mean,
Well,
how far back can we go?
That's a good question. That's a good question. And you'll see a certain individual on television that will tell you, once the paper trail runs out, then you go to DNA. Well, that certain person doesn't have a clue to what the paper trail is. Now, let's take one institution. And you know there's thousands of institutions that have records. One institution, the National Archives of the United States of America. They're one of the primary sources for genealogical research. You know how many documents they have just in the National Archives?
No, I don't.
12 billion.
Yikes.
12 billion. That's one institution. So when you look at the thousands of institutions that you have available that you can research, the paper trail is limitless.
Yeah.
Literally limitless.
So in other words, people give up too quickly when they think
Exactly.
they're at their end of the paper
Exactly.
trail.
Exactly.
There's more.
Exactly. Exactly. And not only that, but I've talked to different archivists and librarians, and I've asked them one question that I've been fascinated about. Of your collection, how much of your collection is unprocessed and uncatalogued? And you know what the response is? Anywhere from 20 to 50 to 60%.
So it's like having a garage full of junk that you haven't gone
Right.
through. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So how can you say the paper trail ends when the archivists and the librarians haven't even cataloged everything they even have in their collection? One of the places I researched, I mentioned, was Prince George County, Maryland. I went to Annapolis, where the Hall of Records is for Maryland, and I found the collection for one of the slave owners on research, and you know what it said? Unprocessed collection. You know how long it's been in the institution? 40 years.
Do you have any idea what that looks like physically? Is it like a warehouse of just boxes and stuff?
Yes. I've been through the archives of many local, state, and national archives around the country. And yeah, they're all boxes. This one lady, I researched, again, the Underground Railroad. A lady did research, did a book on Underground Railroad in one particular state. I went to look at her collection, and it's just boxes and boxes of stuff that's just all thrown in there. So when she delivered it, it was unorganized, and so now the institution has to organize her collection and process it so someone can use it to figure out what's there and what's not there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just makes you wonder through through eternity, or since man showed up, how much stuff that documented life from the beginning has gone from the warehouse, so to speak, to being thrown in the ocean, and it's not there anymore.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Lots. And the answer would be lots.
Yes. Yes. Oh, quite a bit. And they're still discovering stuff. There's a historian, and I can't remember his name, but he had a real famous quote. I wouldn't say it's a famous quote. He had a quote that I really loved, and I need to go back and memorize his quote. But he did an introduction. His quote was used in an introduction of a book on researching the Underground Railroad. And people said, well, you can't research the Underground Railroad because it was secret. Well, it was secret, but there's a lot of it that people know. There was a lot of historical records that were created. William Steele, who was underground station master in Philadelphia, every freedom seeker that came through Philadelphia, he interviewed them and documented their history in his journal as they left the South, came through Philadelphia on their way going up through Canada. So there's a lot that is documented. But anyway, he was saying that something similar to, like, of all the records that exist, only a few of them are known by historians. Of those few that are known by historians, only some of them have been cataloged. And only some of those have been cataloged, only some of those are aware of historians, and only a few of those have been read. And he just goes down a long list to let you know that what we have available is only at the tip of the iceberg of the world that exists in terms of documents and history.
Sure.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And, in the end, the conclusion you come to, or at least I do, is that this is where genealogy meets archaeology.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There are documents that you have to dig for, literally.
I worked on an archaeological dig. There in Chicago, there was an archaeological dig a couple years ago. In fact, they're going to dig again this year. There was a Civil War prisoner of war camp in Chicago. And some archaeologists have started to dig in Chicago to see if they can find remnants of that POW camp in Chicago. So I read about it, and I went down and I participated in the dig.
Did they find anything?
It wasn't. Yeah, they did. They found a lot of stuff, and it wasn't far from where I live. I know the community. In fact, it's actually an African American community now. It hadn't been totally historically, but it is now. And so when I participated in that, I told the person in charge of the dig, I'd like to do research on that community, or at least on that block where they were doing the dig, to see if I can find out what people actually lived in those houses. Because as you do an archaeological dig, you go down layer by layer, and the further you go down, the more back in history, that you go to. So yeah, it's very related to archaeology. Also, I tell people, if you've done all or a lot of the basic sources, and you want to look for some unusual sources, one of the unusual sources you could research as African Americans is archaeology and anthropology. They've done archaeological digs on plantations. And so when they do an archaeological dig in a plantation, they not only bring in archaeologists to dig through the dirt, but they bring in historians to give you the history of that plantation and the people that live there. They bring in anthropologists, they bring in sociologists, they bring in all kind of scholars so they can interpret what it is that they're finding.
They get a whole bunch of people to look at the same collection of dirt.
Exactly.
So you can really draw.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you had an ancestor that lived on that plantation, that's a gold mine for you that you would never even be aware of if you weren't into anthropology or archaeology.
Yeah. It is fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's just get back real quick because hour goes by quickly here. You want to just highlight what your presentation was here on campus this time?
Sure. Well, my talk was why African Americans should research their family history. And so I talked about the importance of it and the fact that our history has been denied, it's been distorted. And so that we have a need to do that and research our ancestors and recreate and correct that historical record. I talked about how when you do research, you can add to the historical record. And I talked about Harriet Tubman, and I talked about the Battle of Lake Erie and my ancestors that fought in it. I talked about the fun and the fascination of genealogy, and I talked about learning about my grandfather and his whole law career. And also I talked about the fact that he had a brother that I never even knew about, that lived around the corner, and the fact that his brother and my grandfather lived two completely different lives, and so I talked about a lot of discoveries that I learned about why I do some of the things that I do. The fact that, whenever I go out the house, I feel uncomfortable unless my shoes are shined, And I remembered that my dad used to always tell me that, son, you're never completely dressed until your shoes are shined, So I always had to shine my shoes when I was young. Then when I researched my grandfather, I found out that he won an award for being the best dressed, And then I found out his father was a Pullman porter, and as Pullman porters, one of the things they had to do was shine their shoes and shine the shoes of their passengers. So I never had a clue that this had gone down through 4 generations, So what I did in my presentation was I tried to give them lessons, methodology, tell them how genealogy would help them in their schoolwork, and how if they got off the web and they went into libraries and archives and courthouses, there would be a leg up on their other classmates that only searched on the web, So just to let them know that genealogy is fun, it's interesting, it's important, and it can help you in anything that you do.
You bet. Just looking at your shoes, Tony, you can't shine those, man. can't shine mine either. I got not today. So you do so much. You're an author. You speak, but you have clients, right? I mean, if somebody gets, who are you serving here? Who could you help? If I would get stuck on something or wanted more to do something I couldn't figure out how to do myself, is that when I'd contact you or what?
Well, my primary clients are those individuals that want their genealogy done. They know they can't do it themselves, but they have the ability to pay, because it's not cheap and it's very time consuming, People that can't afford to pay, I direct them to my book, because that's a cheap way you can learn how to do it yourself.
You bet. The best way to learn more about you and what you
TonyBurroughs.com.
Tony, spell it now, because
BURROUGHS.
Yeah, BURROUGHS, TonyBurroughs.com.
Right.
The book again is, help me out.
Black Roots: A Beginner's Guide to Tracing the African American Family Tree.
Yeah, and you can see that on your website.
Yes, they can order a copy there. They can also get some tips on researching their family history. They can see some videos of presentations that I have done. They can also see my speaking engagements of where I'm going to be speaking next if they want to come out. And
probably also see a replay of this show.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's great to see you again. Thank you,
Ken, it's
Tony.
been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
And thank you for being with us on MCC TV. Our goal is to better acquaint you with the mission, leadership, and the reach of the college. I'm Kent Pavelka for Metropolitan Community College.